All right, here we go. Animal disease and health. This is chapter 4. We're going to talk about disinfection and disinfectants. I know this chapter actually crosses over several different courses because I think it's very important for a lot of things, food sanitation, that kind of stuff. So you might have seen it before, but definitely a very key part of animal disease and health. So what are we worried about? Disinfection and disinfectants. So if you're dealing with places like fairing houses, nursery units, a dairy calf rearing facility, get into the food industry, anything, a processing room, slaughter floor, all those things, sanitation becomes very important. So, but any place you have a live animal, we're talking about a place that's very vulnerable for potential infection. So, if we don't address the sanitary issues within that place and how it's disinfected and cleaned, health problems could become severe for livestock. And then you could have a disease that is transmitted to another animal or even to a human. So one of the things that's really overlooked is like when we want to sanitize or disinfect an area is understanding the proper way to do it. And so cleaning always starts with removing organic material. It's a first requirement to make an area disinfected or sanitized. So you have to have a clean surrounding first and then actually go with the sanitizer or the disinfectant after. So there's really no substitute for that. Most of your sanitizers or disinfectants do not work well in the presence of organic material. And so, again, as it mentions here, there's typically very few, if any, disinfectants that if you apply them to a dirty surface, that it will destroy all the germs that are present. So where can you find organic material? Not only is it in basically the dirt, manure, food particles, fat, that kind of stuff. And so they actually become protection for any of those infective organisms and basically protect them from the killing activity as a sanitizer or disinfectant. So again, removing organic material typically is what we're talking about, basically cleaning and then we sanitize afterwards. So, remove organic materials with a shovel or a broom. Say if we're looking at a horse stall, we're going to try to clean everything out as much as possible. You can use a high pressure pump, you can use detergent, a high velocity stream of water, anything we want to remove all that organic material or dirt. And so steam can become an effective cleaner. And if you get enough temperature, steam can also become an effective sanitizer, but it's got to be done twice. So when it's used alone, the steam is only effective in killing when it's applied directly through a nozzle and not more than 6 to 8 inches away. So it has to be relatively close to use it as a sanitizer or disinfectant. So if you have excessive manure in an area, obviously sanitation is going to be made more effective by using a detergent. So what a detergent, which we want to call it a soap detergent, whatever, all very similar. Basically, it's going to speed up or hasten dirt removal by increasing the wetting speed of that material, breaking it down into smaller particles, and then suspending it. So depending on what it is, there's different types, but when you have protein, fat, or even a carbohydrate, basically it emulsifies it with the actual soap itself and allows it to be suspended with water and then removed away. So thus, once they're removed, it allows for the disinfectant to actually penetrate and kill anything that is left. So your selection of your disinfectant becomes very, very important. If you're talking about buildings, it should work well in the presence of organic matter because sometimes you don't get a surface completely cleaned. Okay, but we also want the disinfectant to be compatible with detergents and soaps. We don't want it to be harmful to our building materials. We don't want it to cause rust, and some of them do, so you have to be very careful with that. We also want them to be relatively non-toxic, and so we'll talk about some of them, what their advantages and disadvantages are. But it all boils down to a sanitizer or disinfectant is something called phenol coefficient, which is the killing strength of a disinfectant compared to phenol or carbolic acid. So it basically the number indicates how many times more or less the disinfectant can be diluted than phenol and still remain or retain an equal disinfecting value. Basically it says how much can you dilute it and still actually be effective against killing organisms. So the phenol coefficient is actually determined by comparing that disinfectant with phenol, and the organism they use is the typhoid fever germ, which is Salmonella typhi. So to some extent, the low phenol coefficient kind of indicates inferiority of a product to some extent, which means if you dilute it down too much, it's really not going to work. So in some cases, there's some people that'll disagree with that and say, well, it really just means how many times you can dilute it down. But if you don't have a very high number, you really can't dilute it down very much at all. So, but on the flip side, it really can't be said that a high phenol coefficient means it's superior because you're also talking about different organisms. You're also talking about it's in a lab condition. So, sometimes you take the phenol coefficient number with a little bit of a grain of salt. So, again, it may not be the real world. But when you look at how these disinfectants or sanitizers work in terms of their germicidal action, that basically they're destroying them. We look at four different things. They're going to work through oxidation, so basically they're going to burn it. They're going to gain electron from itself or another source, combine chemically with that germ, and oxidize or burn it. Okay. Two, basically they're going to remove the water from it, so they'll basically take the moisture out of that germ, which allows it to dry out. Most of them are going to need water to survive. Number third is basically coagulation. They're going to take the fluid of that substance and change it to a jelly-like solid. And of course, that's not also usable by that organism, so it'll inhibit basically their ability to survive. And my fourth one would be by causing a chemical reaction. They can react to form a new complex compound that is free from harmful qualities. So these are just some desirable characteristics of a disinfectant, and you look at has there been an ideal one? Has probably never been discovered, and there will there ever be? The chances are probably not. As much as organisms are changing, it just doesn't seem likely. So here are some of the desirable features. Again, we want them to be reasonably low priced, especially if it's purchased in large quantities for, a large feedlot or dairy or something like that. Free from strong or objectionable odors, especially again if you're dealing with something like a dairy and might go into food. Yeah, we don't want to taint any of the products coming from it. Maybe you're a sheep producer and you're producing wool. We don't want the product to smell like your sanitizer. So we don't want to be excessively destructive to the materials around that animal or even tissues other than what it's trying to work on. So carbolic acid, it'll destroy infections, and it also has an effect on animal tissues like skin and muscle. So additionally, we don't want it to remain poisonous after it's applied. We want it to do its job and then have a very low shelf life and basically disintegrate or disappear. So to remain active, we don't want it to combine chemically with any material, utensils, blood, that kind of stuff. We want it to be active on its own. We also don't want it to be irritating or poisonous when it's inhaled. Some are, like chlorine, aka bleach, and formaldehyde. We want it to be effective at ordinary temperatures, but not lose effectiveness on, a mild day when it's a little bit cooler. We want it to be broad spectrum across temperature. We want it to be effective when it's diluted with water, and that's where, to some extent, the phenol coefficient comes in. So we want it to remain effective not only when it's concentrated, but also if it's diluted. Again, where you're going to use the water as the medium for delivery. We must have it mix readily and uniformly with water. So think about it. Can it be oil-based? Not really. So we don't want it to remain on the surface. Again, it's a form that's easily and economically transported. That's also going to be important. We'll talk about a couple of different types of disinfectants, whether it's a chemical or a mechanical. So if you look at a chemical disinfectant, it has the lethal action due to its ability to actually react with the proteins and essential enzymes of a microorganism. So anything that will coagulate, precipitate, or denature protein will also act as a disinfectant. So I kind of bring into the use in the food industry. Basically, a lot of swine production places will actually have a scalding aid that is added to their scalding water when they try to remove the hair of pigs. And so one of them that's out there is called Old Baldy, and that actually denatures the protein follicle in the hair to allow it to be sloughed off and removed. So it actually becomes, since it does denature the protein there, it actually can become a disinfectant to the skin of a pig during pork harvest. So there's four primary chemical groups that possess the ability to denature, coagulate, or precipitate proteins, and they are phenols, which is where phenol coefficient comes from. There's your halogens, there are your quaternary ammonia compounds, and then there are your formals. So there's other things like dyes, heavy metals, soaps, and alcohols also have that ability, but we look at those four main groups. So the common characteristic of these chemical disinfectants is that at progressively weaker concentration, their lethal activities become slower or less effective, and sometimes we want that to happen. So the ultimate effect, whether a disinfectant is bactericidal or bacteriostatic, so do they kill or do they just interfere with them? That's really determined by three things. What is the concentration of the disinfectant? Number two, how much time do you give it to have contact with that infection or the environment or whatever we're trying to disinfect? Number three, a lot of times temperature plays a huge role. All right, so let's talk about phenols. First, phenols would include things like coal tar oil, which is always fun to say. So those would be things like carbolic acid, cresol, and pine oil. Have you heard of pine sol? There you go. It's basically a phenol from coal tar oil. Then when you have your carbolic acid, so that's derived from coal tar oils as well. But typically, if you find this stuff in a liquid saleable condition in most of your stores, so again, this is a type of phenol. And so they liquefy it, the solid thing, by exposing it to heat and then adding 10% either water or glycerin to it. So it's probably one of the oldest known disinfectants. I actually saw this on the History Channel deal or something like that that talked about this actual Dr. Lister, who was a pioneer surgeon. It's one of the first people to use a disinfectant, use it for keeping wounds clear of infection, especially during war. You know, they had open wounds, it was dirty, and that's one of the things he first discovered. So carbolic acid is a pretty stable compound. It doesn't suffer a lot of deterioration from air or light exposure, which is good. If you injure or if you put fabrics inside of it, it's not going to change them or damage them in any way, shape, or form. And it's effective against germs, especially if there's a little bit of organic material present, which is good. So the problem is you got to have a lot of exposure time, about 24 hours. Okay. So you can readily find it in drugstores and supermarkets, things that do have some carbolic acid in it. So the disadvantages of carbolic acid is extremely poisonous. So it's really unsafe to have on your premises, and that's why it's not used a lot. You know, in the household, it's not too bad, and it's diluted down with that kind of stuff we've talked about. And number two, it does have a penetrating odor. So again, it makes something smell great, but it's readily absorbed by milk, meat, and wool. So it's definitely not used in food operations. It also, when it's in a cold solution, doesn't work very well. It needs to be hot. Okay. And it's also not effective against the viruses that can cause foot and mouth disease and fowl pox and some others. Next one is cresol. It's from coal tar. Instead of coal tar oil, it's coal tar where they get cresol. So it's effective against many bacteria and viruses that are out there. Your advantages is your metals are not corroded by it. That's a good one, which will come to bleach. And a lot of people don't realize that bleach is actually pretty corrosive. So again, cresol could be used for like surgical instruments, so a vet might use something like that if they're not using an autoclave, which is probably what they're going to use. It's almost non-irritant to the skin. I always love that. Almost. So it's not bad, but it does irritate a little bit to your skin. If you use it at recommended strength, it's not bad. So it is soapy, so it allows penetration. It allows it to cling on objects, especially if they are vertical. So that's a good advantage it does have. So some other disadvantages: it's less poisonous, but it's more germicidal than carbolic acid. As a deodorant, it destroys putrefactive germs and replaces their bad odor. And the cost is pretty low comparatively. So the principal disadvantage comes again for the food industry that, yeah, the odor that's there, it is a good deodorant, but it'll taint everything in the same room. So that's kind of the big disadvantage. All right, now we got your halogens. And they're like, okay, it sounds like headlamps on a car now, or halogen headlights, but that's not what we're talking about. So there's actually four substances that make up the group of halogens. And these you probably go, oh, that makes sense. Think about it. If you've had surgery before, you probably had iodine put on your body. So iodine's one of those things. It's a halogen. Number two, chlorine, aka chlorinated lime or bleach. Number three, bromine. And number four, fluorine. Makes sense. Things we use to treat water. Fluorine. So look at iodine. Resublimed iodine has a phenol coefficient of somewhere between 170 to 235. So you can actually dilute it down quite a bit and still remain pretty effective. So it's one of few that is immediately destructive to the bacterial spores. And why do you think that's used for humans, for surgery and basically to disinfect an area? Because of that. So we know spores are highly resistant to just about anything. So the problem is it does lower the natural resistance of the skin to other types of organisms, other types of germs. But it could be used in an application maybe of ringworm or lumpy jaw, lump jaw, which is actually called actinobacillosis, if I remember right, the true name of it. But so that's the problem. We do use it in surgery, but if you think about when people have surgery, what they put them on to help destroy any potential infection afterwards, they put them on an antibiotic. So if they're using iodine, it lowers the natural resistance of their skin, and that's why they're giving them the antibiotic. Chlorine, most people don't think about this. It's actually chlorinated lime, what we would call bleach. Okay, it's a very powerful disinfectant due to the amount of chlorine gas that is produced, and that's what gives you that clean chlorine smell. It's a good deodorant, works pretty good. The disadvantage of it, especially if you get into stables with animals, number one, it's the expense compared to the quantity you have to use for it. Number two, if it absorbs, it's going to be turned white. So it does have some quote unquote bleaching characteristics. Here's a big one. Can't use it around metal. It is corrosive to metals. I can tell you this from for a big example, and for our meat judging program, and now with our meat lab, I've been on this campus at Garden City Community College for 19 years. and I am on my fourth washing machine to wash frocks for judging and for our meat lab. And that's because if you get bleach on the metal part and not the little plastic where it goes in there, it will corrode that metal. I had one of them where that thing just completely fell out because it corroded so much. So it can be irritating to your mucous membranes of your nose and your throat. Again, meat or milk that smells like bleach is not a good thing. And then chlorine is actually pretty unstable, so you just have to be careful with storage of it. So it has a very low phenol coefficient. It's only 21, so that means it can be diluted down very quickly. So just kind of an example of it is after my first year, I was kind of in one end of the building, and I was moving to the south end, the same building I'm in now, to a different office, and I had a cart with like an old crappy cart that had like 10 bottles of bleach on it, and I hit a transition from tile to carpet in our building, which I finally got to remove the carpet, but I hit that and a couple of the bottles came off that cart and one of them popped its lid, and so now I've got a whole bottle of chlorine bleach on the carpet. And we did it fast enough that we dumped enough water and got a shop vac, and it did not stain the carpet. That's how easily we diluted it down so it didn't stain. So kind of goes back to the phenol coefficient. You can dilute it down pretty quickly. So it does have, again, evidence that it destroys some viruses like foot and mouth and then some other ones. And of course, most people don't realize this, that, we think about chlorine bleach as the liquid form, which is dissolved in water, but there actually is a powdered form. So if you've seen like Clorox 2, that is a powdered bleach. So we don't really talk about the other ones, the fluorine or bromine a lot. Probably should bring in bromine a lot. It's getting more use in some areas of the food industry, like on kill floors and stuff. But now we should bring to a really big one, which is what I use in my wheat lab, which is a quaternary base. So it's a quaternary ammonia compound. So this has really emerged into prominence over the last 15 to 20, 25 years. It's a very large group of cationic types of organism with a very good surface activity on microorganisms. So, which is why the actual kind of acronym for them is surface active cationic germicides. So the bacterial action, is, or excuse me, the bactericidal action is attributed to the inactivation of enzymes, denaturing of essential proteins, and disrupting the cell membrane. If you disrupt the cell wall, it's just like the skin of an organism. Just like if we didn't have the skin, we'd die of an infection. Same thing for a microorganism. So basically it causes leakage and leak out their moisture and then thus basically lose their water content. So the antibacterial activities though are suppressed in the presence of organic materials. So quaternary ammonia compounds, you have to have a clean surface for it to work. So additionally, due to the chemical makeup, you never want to use a soap. You want to make sure that you have a surface that's completely free of any soap or detergent. It's also more effective against gram-positive organisms than it is against gram-negative. So knowing what type of cell wall is what gram-negative means, they basically stain the outside of it and basically see what type of cell wall it has, and that tells you if it's gram-positive or gram-negative. And know thus, in this case, quats work better on gram-positives. So as I mentioned, the grams method is just basically utilize the same germs for kind of somewhat of identification. That way, if I want to find out if it's whatever organism, I don't want to do all these different methods. I can at least narrow it down by first staining them and say, are they gram positive or are they gram negative? Okay. So what you do basically is there's a couple of different stain solutions that they put on there. And then the last thing, if they have the stain was washed off by alcohol, that means it's going to be turned pink, then it is gram negative. But if the stain is not washed off by the alcohol solution, it means it's gram positive and it'll actually be a purple color. So you're going to use something like safranin, then you're going to decolorize it, and then you're going to basically add this stain solution, and then the last thing is alcohol. And so again, if the alcohol washes off anything and it turns pink, it's gram negative. If the organism actually stays purple on the slide that it's done, it's gram negative. Excuse me, it's gram positive, it's purple. So again, going back, while quats are effective on bacteria and fungus, they don't always kill spores, and they have trouble with some viruses. So formals may be something that's new to you. We all know formaldehyde. If you've ever, were in high school and you dissected the fetal cat or the fetal pigs or worms or whatever, most people don't realize that formaldehyde is actually a gas. And so that's what they say, that those fetal cats and pigs and stuff are in formaldehyde, and that's actually incorrect. It's actually formalin. That's the liquid. So formaldehyde is a gas, but it's soluble in water. So when we mix a water solution with formaldehyde gas, it's actually called formalin. So that's a little bit different. And why they use it, it's actually preserves those things, so it's a very effective disinfectant. So the advantage of it is, again, being that it's lethal to viruses, it's lethal to bacteria, fungi, and also spores, and that's why it's used. It's also highly reactive to amino acids and proteins. So the big thing is humidity does become an important factor. If it's increased, the activity of the formaldehyde gas will increase. And that can become somewhat troubling if you have to smell it and inhale it all the time. So there's some classifications we look at as other chemical substances. One of those might be sodium orthophenylphenate. That can actually be a combination. When you put it with a detergent, it provides basically somewhat of a one-step sanitation program. Okay, so why it's used, it doesn't have an objectionable odor, it's readily soluble in water, and has a high germicidal activity. It's also, again, it works in the presence of detergents, so which means it'll also perform well in the presence of organic material. It does have a little bit of irritation if you get it in your eyes or your mucous membranes. So sodium orthophenylphenate is effective against things like brucellosis, tuberculosis, vesicular xanthoma, vesicular stomatitis. We'll talk about each one of those in detail later. So it's actually approved for use in federal, state animal disease eradication programs. Typically, it's one of the official disinfectants for many of your large livestock shows as well. Then you have lye. So typically, you can find household lye, basically similar to lime. So it's highly rated against viruses like foot and mouth, foulpox, dog's distemper, and also some other types of germs, some bacteria like anthrax and its spores, brucellosis as well. Biggest thing is most effective when it's basically at a room temperature solution as opposed to hot, so it works best at about 70 degrees. Vinegar. So of good grade, if you think of like if you're in the packing industry and one of their solutions they might use as an intervention would be like microtox, which is typically peracetic acid. Basically, it is a form of vinegar. So, good grade acetic acid should be somewhere around 5 to 6% acetic acid. So again, it can be used as a sanitizer. It compares pretty favorably with official dilutic acetic acid, but again, we want one to be officially diluted because it's preferable, because it's colorless, has greater purity, and it has a uniform strength at that 6%. So again, if the diluted acetic acid, that official one, is not always available, yes, you can use vinegar, and I've used that before. Obviously, if you think about, if you're making pickles, you take a cucumber and you preserve it in what? Vinegar. So it can also prevent, obviously, those organisms from invading and destroying. You can also apply it to wounds. It can kill pus-producing types of bacteria. It can be used for foot and rot in livestock if it catch it early. So all the things we talked about previously were chemical disinfectants, and so now we'll transition to your non-chemical disinfectants. So basically the two methods that are used for disinfection or can actually disinfect are what we call your mechanical actions or agencies or your natural disinfectants. So mechanical ones will be include the processes of basically sweeping, brushing, scraping, but using probably water under pressure is the biggest thing. And the best method is basically to dampen all the materials, to use this mechanical method, and then transport it somewhere else. So dampening prevents those microorganisms from being basically becoming airborne as well. So again, dampening is better than just water under pressure because again, now you got airborne stuff and it gets everywhere and contaminates the environment. So a lot of times you really can't trust a mechanical agency to do proper disinfectant. So we're typically counting on chemical and natural processes to some extent. So as previously mentioned, sunlight is a big one because it creates ultraviolet radiation, and if it can reach germs or spores, it will destroy them if it can get to them. Problem is the ultraviolet rays cannot pass through glass or haze. So it's not going to go through a window. Again, if you got hazy or cloudy conditions, definitely not going to work very well. It also needs direct UV radiation, so during dusk and dawn, early morning and evening, again, there's too much of an angle of the sun, so it's really not very effective at that point. Obviously, if you have a carcass that some type of infection destroyed it, and it's on the inside, not really going to do anything. It's only effective against a surface infection. It doesn't penetrate through mucus, manure, dirt, organic material, etc. So again, yeah, it can work, but it's very limited use. Okay, it's very slow. So heat would also be basically a natural area that we can look at. If you have heat in sufficient concentration, it is deadly to basically every single form of life. That makes sense, right? If you get too hot, you die. Organisms get too hot, they die. All those things. So that includes parasites and most of your microorganisms. So we can use that maybe as steam under pressure, scalding water. What about pasteurization? That can use heat. That's depending on how we generate that heat. It's a little different. If we burn a carcass, we destroy a building that had a large infestation in it, whatever it is. I kind of want to bring you back to that pasteurization. There's two different methods that are used. One's the holding method, which is not very popular. It's kind of the most general use in terms of that it was done before, but the newer method's a lot better. So what you do is you heat a product to a duration of 30 minutes as long as you have a temperature between 140 and 148 degrees with an average temperature of 143.8. So think about, let's just go to your pasteurizing milk or apple juice or whatever it is. If you're about speed and efficiency, that is not fast. So most of them have really switched to your high temperature short time, which is called the flash method. So basically heat it quickly to a higher temperature and hold it. And it's typically we generate that heat through electricity. It can go through milk. I know Anheuser-Busch products, they pasteurize their beer. And so it's high frequency alternating electrical current, anywhere between 2500 to 6000 volts. And it reaches a temperature of 161 degrees and it's held for 15 seconds. So you can do just a little bit higher temperature and you cut down the time from 30 minutes to 15 seconds. Sedimentation is also a natural way. It's nature's way of purifying water that is not in motion. So the germs will settle down because of their molecular weight to the bottom, where in time, again, they don't have nutrients or it's too cold or whatever it is and they don't survive. So the biggest thing, we can't depend on this in a small pool or pond because they could repeatedly get infections. And again, if it's not if it's pretty shallow, you really can't count on that deep sedimentation to happen. Time's kind of similar to heat in a way that, again, all living things have to die at some point. They're not going to be immortal and live forever. So, of course, that's quite variable. Depending on what it is, it could take maybe a few days, it could take several years. So, if the microorganism that is responsible for producing brucellosis, it actually can live in frozen pastures for several months, although when it gets hot, it can only survive for maybe a couple of days. So, again, even the individual organism, depending on what it is, it might not be as easy to destroy. So, typically, it's extreme dryness that accounts for the death of most of your organisms. But again, time does play a role. So, we talked about electricity a little bit when we looked at pasteurization. So, basically, it's destructive to germ life by basically because the ability of electricity to create heat. So the problem can be, though, it can free elements from chemical combinations. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. In the case of chlorine, that's not a good thing. Now you got chlorine gas that's present. So again, it's the direct action of that electrical current that is really going to cause the heat generating ability to destroy organisms. What about your bodily juices? So if you think about things like blood serum, white blood cells, your phagocytes, your red blood cells, and then your gastric juice in the stomach, either they can destroy things, they can break down things, or they're acidic. So that's kind of the common thing. So a blood serum would basically kill microorganisms because they're unnatural to the body. Your white blood cells would eat or ingest those organisms that are in your circulatory system. They gradually actually grow around the germ and dispose of it out of the body. And then if your white cell wins, again, the animal will resist infection. If it doesn't, a disease could set in. And with the gastric juice being an acid, that's what makes it destructive, is because of its acidity. We don't think about it a lot, but an antibiotic, again, can also serve to some extent as a disinfectant. So since they destroy microorganisms or control them. So they are antibacterial substances of biological origin that are derived from either bacteria, so things like bacitracin, tyrothricin, pyokinase, could be actinomyces like actinomycin or streptomycin. It actually comes from molds or fungi like penicillin and flavicin. And then we have those that are basically derivatives that are created in labs like ampicillin and neomycin. So again, we can get these from natural substances other than bacteria, these antibiotics. So these may be not antibiotics per se, but they have antimicrobial properties to them, so they work very similar. So allicin, you can actually find in basically garlic. Canavalin is something that's in soybean flour. Chlorelin is in freshwater seaweed. Lysozyme you find in saliva, tears, but also egg whites. So obviously your best known antibiotic is penicillin, which actually comes from the mold Penicillium notatum. It's been used for infections for many years, but it also works well in things like Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, Pneumonococcus, and your gram-positive microorganisms. Animals, mastitis, that's the big thing penicillin's used for. And then some derivatives would be like amoxicillin, ampicillin. They are members of the penicillin family. They are derived semi-synthetically, very active against a large number of gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria, and that's what makes them a little bit better. The problem is they can be easily destroyed by the body's producing penicillinases, by the bacteria that are there. So basically, they have their own defense mechanism that can destroy them. So that's kind of the negative. Streptomycin is actually derived from Actinomyces, which is or Streptomyces rhesus microorganism. It's also effective against gram-negative organisms, but not as effective against gram-positives like penicillin. And then you have your oxytetracycline, which is a broad-spectrum antibiotic. It's effective against a large number of gram-positive and gram-negative organisms. All right, so that's the end of chapter 4. Complete your quiz and Canvas, and if there is an exam or an assignment, make sure you do those as well as any weekly discussion.